do the improvements in these sleep metrics actually pay off in a meaningful way relative to the weight, health, and fitness outcomes that we want? Maybe a food helps me fall asleep 10 minutes faster, but I still slept for 7 hours overall. What's really changed in my life? Nothing.
Hello and welcome to the Consistency Project podcast. My name is Patrick Cummings. As always, I am here with E.C. Sinkowski. Every week on the show, we aim to simplify the science of nutrition, health, and fitness, cutting through the noise to focus on the principles and practices that'll help you perform better, feel better, and live better. Thank you for tuning into the show this week. How the heck are you, E.C.?
I'm good. How are you doing?
I'm wonderful. We have this week a conversation about the role that nutrition has in improving our sleep. And then we'll close out the episode with another hot cake, a new hot cake, this one on ultra-processed foods. So I'm excited to get to that. But first, we're going to talk about sleep and the role that diet plays in sleep. All right, but first, let's get us into our main conversation today, all about how to improve our sleep quality with diet. So let's dive right into this. How much sleep is enough? And why is it so important? I think maybe that's the second question is the better question. But why is it so important? And how much do we need to be a useful human being?
Yeah. Sleep, it sounds so easy. We're going to get really complicated quite quickly here. But yeah, how much sleep is enough? There is actually a pretty good consensus that we need a minimum of 7 hours of night. This is coming from the American Association of Sleep Medicine, also the Sleep Research Society, and the National Sleep Foundation, all putting a minimum at 7 hours. The National Sleep Foundation then also puts an upper cap of 9 hours a night. And so we find that there's the lowest health risk is associated with those who sleep between 7 and 8 hours a night. And it's like really a U-shaped curve where risk increases when sleep is both too low and too high. So we see risk really increase, below 6 and of course even more so below 5 hours. But then also at the high end, which I don't think people always think about because oftentimes we think, more is always better. But, somebody sleeping over 9 hours a night, this might be more indicative of a problem, mental health issues like depression, for example, right? Now, of course, there's always going to be genetic variation. We're talking about biology. So some people will do better with a full 8 or a full 9. But the nuance here is that more isn't always better. 7 could be quite fine for a lot of people. But we do find that about 25 to 30% of the U.S. population reports sleeping less than 6 hours of sleep a night. So certainly a good percentage of us are not getting enough healthy sleep. Now, why is it so important? Why is it so vital to our health? Well, of course, the exact mechanisms are still being researched. I can't give you all of the specifics. But we do find that short sleep duration increases the risk for death and disease like diabetes and cardiovascular disease, our top killer. We also find it increases your risk for a higher BMI, your risk for obesity, hypertension, hypercholesterolemia, stroke, and then even things like accidents, right? So some of the reason why this could be occurring, staying really high level given the length of our podcast. But for things like increased BMI or increased risk of obesity, we find that lack of sleep makes people more hungry. And it's probably related to what it does to our hunger hormones. We find a decrease in leptin, which kind of keeps us feeling full, and an increase in ghrelin, which is known as the hunger hormone. It makes us more hungry. It also, lack of sleep increases our food reward sensitization, meaning when we eat that, carb and fat bomb that tastes delicious, we get an even greater dopamine hit, which of course from, a behavior point of view, it wants us to keep doing that. And then of course it could be so simple as when we don't sleep as much, we just have more hours on the clock at which we're allowed to keep eating, right? So all of these different mechanisms could be feeding into, okay, why do we see increased BMI and why do we see, increased obesity? Things like hypertension and cardiovascular disease. Why do we see that with a decreased risk of sleep? Well, it turns out that when you sleep, it actually decreases your blood pressure, and having a high blood pressure for more hours of the day could be causing more damage to the blood vessel, which then, of course, is making the heart work more, and maybe we're not delivering enough nutrients as much. And then to look at something even different besides kind of our chronic diseases, when we look at stats of things like car accidents, we find that you're 33% more likely to be in a car accident if you're sleeping less than 6 hours a night. And what's really interesting here is in that study, they actually asked individuals if they felt sleepy or if they reported excessive sleepiness when sleeping less than 6 hours and they didn't. So this is where sometimes perception is different than reality, which is really interesting. And then even things that maybe are a little bit less immediately catastrophic, we find that when we don't have enough sleep, we have trouble like being able to process all of those memories effectively and being able to access that information later. And so this is how it can come into play when we're talking about work productivity, how you perform in school and your job, all of that stuff. And even then memory starts to become an issue in the long term because sleep tends to remove some of the waste products that we see associated with Alzheimer's disease and dementia. So that's just a really quick and brief overview of why we see kind of the short sleep duration could be playing into all of these different kind of death and disease outcomes. Now, lots of different reasons why people don't sleep enough, from work responsibilities to maybe some poor lifestyle choices like really stoked on some Netflix new series, right? And of course, other health conditions that are just a little bit outside the scope of this, like restless leg syndrome or sleep apnea. But if a lot of people, the most kind of common complaint related to not getting enough sleep is just insomnia. And so I just wanted to touch on what that means because I think, it's important to understand definitions a little bit. So insomnia is when you have trouble falling asleep, staying asleep, or waking up too early in the morning, even though you've had the opportunity to get a full night's sleep. And of course, there's going to be variation here, but short-term insomnia is when we have this lasting up to about 3 months. At any given time, this is affecting about 15 to 20% of people. And chronic insomnia is when it's at least 3 times a week, lasts for more than 3 months. About 10% of people have this. And really, if you're somebody afflicted by chronic insomnia, you really should go see a doctor to see, what might be at play besides just, oh gosh, I can't fall asleep.
I know we want to talk about diet, and we'll get into it, but it strikes me as worth pointing out, because you talked about it a little bit, like work responsibilities or Netflix. I think a lot about, when thinking about insomnia or not sleeping enough, so much of it comes back down to stress and elevated stress levels and how what happens in the day affects what we try to do at night. And then there's that perpetual negative loop of the next day. And when you're more tired, when you're more sleep deprived, you're more stressed. And then there's a cycle. So, again, we're going to talk about nutrition and what we often talk about here, but it's one of those things that when we've talked about the blue zones, we've talked about those, the broader definition of what makes a healthy person. A big part of that is figuring out how to decrease the amount of stress so that you can sleep through the night, so that quantity and quality is high enough, so that you can go into the next day and operate. So, anyways, again, I just wanted to point that out, that I think there's so much to sleep, that some of which we'll talk about today, and some of which will be probably outside the scope, which is just like making sure that the 18 hours we are awake is setting us up to sleep well that night.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great point. One of the studies I did look at related to exercise, and wasn't going to have it here so much in detail, but I just love the point. If I recall correctly, they found that like mindfulness interventions were as effective as exercise in terms of the positive impact on sleep. So kind of getting at your idea here, like we want to use some of the day to process some of the emotions we have around stress versus being the first quiet moment you have to kind of think about things be when you put the head on the pillow. It's like, why can't I fall asleep? It's like, okay, well, now You're trying to deal with all of the things that we didn't deal with earlier, right? Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, I love that. Okay, cool. So back to what you started this conversation with, which is this sort of 7 to 9 hours of sleep every night aim. Is that really like, let's oversimplify and say like, that's what we should be aiming for? Like, that's it. Right. Beginning of podcast and end of podcast.
I know. Done. That's all you guys have to do for sleep. Done. Oh, if only it were so simple. So this is where we're going to get a little bit more complicated, right? Studies do look at total sleep time, which is really what we could say is sleep quantity. But sleep quality is also important, yet that's really hard to define objectively. And I'm sure everyone knows, what I mean by this, right? Like there's been nights that you've probably slept longer in the sense of hours, but you didn't feel as refreshed, and then vice versa, where maybe you only slept for 6 hours, but you jumped out of bed and were fine all day, right? And so this is where measurements of sleep quality really start to come into play. And some of the more common ones that are used are called sleep onset latency. This is referring to the time it takes for somebody to fall asleep after turning off the lights. And so an average healthy person, this is on the scale of like 10 to 20 minutes to fall asleep. Then there's also something called sleep efficiency. I love that as a term, but it's the percentage of time spent asleep while in bed, right? So maybe you're in bed for 10 hours, but you only slept for 5. Okay, this is a sleep efficiency of 50%. You're not very efficient.
I love that.
Now, normal sleep efficiency is considered to be about 85% or higher. There's also things like how many times do you wake up, like number of sleep disturbances. But maybe that's not as important as how long do you spend awake after you wake up. So that's measured by wakefulness after sleep onset. Maybe you are up for a total of 3 hours, but it's only with 2 disturbances, right? And then there's even things like looking at your sleep architecture, which are these sleep cycles. We go in these 90 to 120 minute cycles of sleep where each cycle should have 4 stages. That includes the REM sleep that we've all heard about, right? And believe me, there's even more measurements of sleep out there for sure. Yep. We're not a sleep podcast, so we're just going to leave it at that as some of the measurements for what sleep quality could be. But what's interesting is, like, you could have all of those, quote, right on paper, but sleep quality is also subject to what the person felt about the sleep experience. It's also subject to their perception. I mean, it kind of reminds me of that article I said of how people didn't feel necessarily sleepy, even though they were still more likely to be in a car accident, right? So there is one more measurement of sleep quality that's important to bring up, and it's this Pittsburgh Quality Sleep Index, or the PSQI, and it's now become this really well-used questionnaire. It's about 19 questions where individuals indicate their own self-reported responses that include things like, how did you feel about your last night's sleep? Because if I had the best sleep architecture on paper, but I felt like it was a terrible night's sleep, well, that's important to know, right? And so this questionnaire, it's scored on a 0 to 21 scale, where if you get 5 or higher, it means that you had some significant sleep disturbance. And so this is the problem. I mean, we've already named a slew of markers here. And so when we're looking at the studies related to sleep, different studies measure different things. Some look at total sleep time. Some look at wakefulness after, sleep disturbances. Some look at the PSQI index. Some look at the combination of it. And so when you say something like, oh, we're going to measure sleep, it sounds so simple, but gets complicated quite quickly. And it really reminds me of that principle 5 I have, right? It's never one thing. And it's important that when you hear, especially for supplements or diet, when people say something like, this diet improves sleep, what does that really mean? Let's say a supplement reduces sleep latency, so reduces the time it takes to fall asleep. But maybe your issue isn't sleep latency. Maybe it's wakefulness after sleep onset. But the supplement just says, we improve sleep quality. It's like, okay, well, maybe that's not getting after the factor that you actually care about. But I think even more interesting than just that is this different ways of measuring things, and if that's relevant, is, do the improvements in these sleep metrics actually pay off in a meaningful way relative to the weight, health, and fitness outcomes that we want? Maybe a food helps me fall asleep 10 minutes faster, but I still slept for 7 hours overall. What's really changed in my life? Nothing. Nothing, right? And so it reminds me a lot of when we've talked about measuring recovery. We only care about measuring recovery so much that it improves our performance. That if we're measuring recovery and we're just trying to maximize our recovery score, but our performance doesn't change, like, what's the difference? We've sort of assumed that if we're trying to maximize our recovery score, that our performance is always going to keep improving with every improvement in recovery. But that's not what actually happens. And so that's where a lot of these recovery measurements have missed the boat. And I think it's the same thing with sleep. We can get a little bit carried away with like, oh my gosh, my sleep efficiency increased from 95 to 98%. It's like, okay, well, what's really changed in your life? Are you actually now making better food choices? Are you actually now able to concentrate more at work? All of that stuff. So I think duration is a good, really simple goal. Like, yeah, shooting for at least 7 hours of sleep a night, but also then checking in on some other metrics, which might be how you feel, but it would be better take that to the next step of, do I really think that I am making better diet choices? Do I really think that I am, have more energy in my workouts, right? Do I really think that I'm more concentrated at work? Because those are the outcomes we care about, not necessarily hitting all of the sleep stats perfectly.
It's interesting because in the middle of that, I was like, oh, she's she's talking about measurements, and well, one way to do that is devices, and everybody's got the devices now, and how wonderful it is that. And then you brought us back to real life at the end, where it's like, well, the point is not to improve the measurement. The point is to improve, again, to your point, how do we feel? How are we performing? All these other things, and the devices don't do that. They are just a really nice proxy to give us, and this is your point, and I think it's a great one. It might be that it gives us the accountability we need, but it's not. Those are not in and of themselves the data, the measurement, the sleep efficiency scores, the Pittsburgh whatever it was. Like nobody's going around saying like I improved my Pittsburgh. I don't remember. I just know it's Pittsburgh
sleep quality index.
So I just think you teased us there. I thought maybe we were going to talk about the benefits of devices, but we brought it back to where we usually do. Okay, so. Devices aside, talk to us a little bit about diet and sleep. I think that's really interesting. I never really thought about, obviously there are supplements, everything from melatonin to, I'm sure we'll get into the other ones. But I never really thought about food as sleep additive, but that's probably just me. So where can we get into that part of the conversation?
Yeah, we got to bring this to nutrition a little bit. Unfortunately, I think we're going to be a little underwhelmed here. This is the GOTAS paper in the show notes from 2021. They did a systematic review of observational studies as well as controlled trials. And so, quote, 29 studies were reviewed. In summary, consumption of healthy foods was associated with better sleep quality, while higher intake of processed and free sugar-rich foods was associated with worse sleep features, end quote. They also note that they haven't found much consistent evidence related to macronutrient intake. Say if somebody's distribution is a little bit higher protein or a little bit higher carb. That's also kind of what I found. There were sort of some mixed results that some say, okay, this macronutrient split is better for sleep, but this one doesn't do anything for sleep, all of that stuff. And I think that sort of intuitively makes sense because somebody's macros can change, but it doesn't actually tell me what they're eating. Somebody can have a higher carbohydrate intake, and that can be from movie popcorn, but that could also be from sweet potatoes. So I think it's going to be hard to make some really broad conclusions just based on looking kind of macro ratios or distribution. Now, the problem with this kind of conclusion that better sleep quality is associated with higher quality foods is these association studies don't necessarily prove anything because of all of the possible confounders. That maybe the people who are eating more high quality foods are also the people who just have a more regular schedule, or maybe they're more regular exercisers. And so it's the schedule or the exercise which is driving the sleep, not necessarily the healthy food. So there's always this healthy user bias. We find that healthy practices tend to cluster together. And so it can be really hard to tease out and be like, no, it's the diet. No, it's the exercise, because these people tend to act similarly. The other thing with these association studies that we have to be mindful of is this reverse causation. We've touched on this before, but I think the simplest way to explain it is kind of the chicken and the egg question, meaning which came first. The assumption in how I just phrased it is that it was eating healthy that drove better sleep. But it could be the reverse. What about sleep driving the better eating practices, as we mentioned, that maybe I'm not as hungry, or maybe I don't have as much reward from the processed foods. And so we always have to be mindful in these association studies, like, is it the other way around from what I'm thinking? And to be honest, it's actually likely both. There's probably a bi-directional relationship here for the reasons that we've mentioned, that the food quality does help the better sleep, but then also the better sleep helps making the better food quality decisions. And this wasn't related to higher quality foods. This was actually looking at ultra processed food consumption. And that's exactly what they did. They looked at it both ways from kind of a study perspective and a statistical perspective, and found that the relationships were there in both directions, that eating poorly resulted in poor sleep and poor sleep resulted in eating poorly. So that was kind of cool to see. Now, in terms of the intervention studies, which are would be the randomized controlled trials, and theoretically be more powerful because that's how, they randomly divide people into groups and they assign them a treatment. We could say, okay, X treatment, X food, X supplement actually causes an outcome. It would give us a more powerful conclusion. But in terms of what exists in the research, it's it's a mixed bag. Some researchers decides they want to look at what does one extra fish fillet do a day, and another researcher wants to look at, okay, what does high zinc food do? So it's hard to really find a lot of research that will kind of say the same thing and be replicated. And I just think in my mind, I'm sure our audience can guess too, as much as we've talked about how the whole diet picture matters, that just giving somebody, okay, go eat an extra fish fillet a day doesn't necessarily change the whole diet picture, such that it's really going to be hard to have something move the needle that drastically. I do want to touch briefly, because I think it'll be a follow-up question. I've seen it certainly in various literature that people recommend like a cherry juice as a tart cherry juice as a popular addition to help promote sleep. And so I did look into that specifically. Unfortunately, the studies are pretty small in terms of sample size, and they're also pretty short in duration, like 2 weeks. So this is really hard to make really strong, broad conclusions for people about, using this specific food like cherry juice to improve your sleep quality.
But if you believe it does, it probably might.
Well,
or it might.
That's a really interesting point. Yes.
Okay, so so big surprise as usual. Right. The conclusion becomes eat a healthy diet of whole foods and et cetera, et cetera. So maybe let's talk about that and why you think, or why the research says that it actually does, or at least the best we can tell, is the best strategy we have to use diet, to use nutrition to improve sleep.
Yeah. Yeah, so in that study that was kind of looking at the research, when I looked through briefly the studies that they were looking at, a lot of them were the Mediterranean diet. And then it was associated with this improvement in sleep quality, and which I think we're actually going to talk about the Mediterranean diet in next week's episode. I think there's some things that make the Mediterranean diet quite special, but then there's also some rather non-unique things. And the non-unique ones are what you just sort of mentioned, surprise, surprise, whole unprocessed foods. We've heard this before, in the right quantities results in better health outcomes. And so, yeah, the Mediterranean diet's got the lots of fruits and veggies, including beans, and then whole grains and nuts as are a big part of the diet. They do have some protein from fish and dairy, less so on meat, but we've kind of touched on whether or not that's a big risk factor in some recent podcasts. But then also, because they're filling up on all of these whole unprocessed foods, they don't have a ton of room for the processed goodies and sweets, and a very moderate amount of alcohol. So, we'll get into it next week. I think there's some really beautiful trends about the Mediterranean diet, but I think we also can't think that it's so hyper-specific and we can accomplish it with lots of different whole unprocessed foods. Now, this is going to get into a little bit of the mechanism of why high quality foods might improve sleep. And I want to put out there that this has not been proven, and there's probably lots of other stuff that comes into play, but here we go. Some of the reason why healthy foods may be improving sleep quality is related to their influence on melatonin and serotonin. So melatonin, we know, or most of us probably know, is kind of this main sleep hormone. It's released by the pineal gland in the brain in response to darkness. It helps with our kind of circadian clock, the every 24 hours thing. We find that we've got low levels during the day. They start to rise in the evening. And about after we kind of have this acute release in the evening, we get sleepy about 2 hours later. Turns out too, like light at night, screen time at night can influence that. So we might come back to that later. And then serotonin is a neurotransmitter, and it also participates in kind of our sleep-wake rhythm and setting the clock for, okay, what time do we wake up? How long are we awake? And all of that stuff, and the cascade of events that help us go through this 24-hour cycle. Now, when we make melatonin, it's made from the amino acid tryptophan, which is an essential amino acid in our diet, and it's converted into melatonin via the serotonin pathway. So what happens is tryptophan is made into serotonin is made into melatonin in the brain. And so we get this essential amino acid tryptophan that's in animal products like beef and poultry, but it's also in dairy, it's in nuts and seeds, it's in whole grains and legumes. And then tryptophan has to pass the blood-brain barrier, which is a complicated process. We're going to keep it brief here, but basically tryptophan has to compete with other amino acids that have to get into the brain. And so if you have a low tryptophan diet, this might be why there's a low then conversion to serotonin and melatonin, because it's competing with other amino acids to get into the brain. What's interesting is that this conversion to melatonin doesn't just require tryptophan. It requires things like magnesium and B vitamins. And so this is where eating diets that are rich in tryptophan and even serotonin and melatonin, which are naturally found in foods, as well as in vitamins and minerals, which we talk about all the time, could all be influencing then our sleep quantity. And so typically, I would imagine this is when people are thinking, okay, great. Tell me the list of the tryptophan foods, or tell me the list of the foods with serotonin. Tell me the list of the foods with melatonin, right? There was a pretty cool table I saw in one of these research studies that I'll send out on this week's email list, just so people can see it. I think it's kind of fun to see where foods rank. But, I think we can kind of get lost in the weeds when we do that. When we look at how we're actually going to apply this information on a daily basis, and the fact that we don't want to eat the same thing every day, it's going to come down to a mixed array of whole unprocessed foods. I'm going to tell you what's on the table. Whole food protein sources, whole food dairy sources, whole food fruits and veggies. And so it can be cool to be like, wow, pineapple has 5 times the serotonin as tomatoes, and walnuts are better than both. But then you have to remember that you don't want to only eat pineapple and walnuts. And so it always comes back to, okay, whole foods are the best sources of these things. I'm not going to eat the same best food every day because of this thing called sustainability. So what does my collective diet look like? And look, when I do a whole array of unprocessed foods, I probably get a good number of the compounds that I need across all of them.
Got it. Okay. And so you didn't say it, but how's the email, the chart? What's how do people get that?
Yeah. How are people going to hack their tryptophan and melatonin diet composition? Yeah.
Your caveat notwithstanding, give me the list.
Give me the list. OptimizeMeNutrition.com/email. Get on that list.
Okay. Awesome. That link is in the show notes too for folks. Okay. So besides what we just laid out, generally a healthy diet, what are some other ways, what are some other strategies that we want to make sure we hit on as it relates to improving sleep?
Yeah, I hinted at it a little bit with the screen time, but this is where kind of the sleep hygiene comes into play, sleep hygiene practices. And so sleep hygiene is defined as the set of behavioral and environmental recommendations intended to promote healthy sleep. And it really is meant to treat this mild to moderate insomnia. It's going to be the best treatment for sleep improvement, again, related to kind of mild and moderate insomnia. And it's just behavior change. There's no hacks. I mean, I guess there's a few kind of decreases or food choice changes, but some of our sleep hygiene practices are to avoid caffeine, nicotine, and alcohol. Alcohol is interesting. For a lot of people, that will decrease sleep latency, so it'll help people fall asleep, but it increases your arousal in the second half of the night. So this is why you'll often find yourself kind of up at 3 a.m. with alcohol consumption. Other sleep hygiene practices: exercise regularly. Heard that one before. Manage stress. We talked about that one already. Reduce bedroom noise, right? Reduce screen time, especially near bedtime. Try to really regulate your sleep hours, sleep and wake hours. So try to keep that consistent bedtime and that consistent get up time in the morning. And then this is also interesting. Avoid daytime naps, specifically greater than 30 minutes, because once we get too much sleep in the day, we're probably not going to be able to sleep as well at night. No real hacks here. A list that is pretty kind of boring by nature. We've certainly talked about some of these basic habits before, and no surprise, they're feeding into better sleep. I did want to touch just very briefly on the caffeine thing, because I think that's a substance that's near and dear to many of our hearts. And it reminded me of something that I sent out to my email list a while back, but they were looking at how late in the day can you have caffeine and for it not to affect your sleep. And they found that when caffeine was consumed less than 8.8 hours prior to bedtime, that it reduced total sleep time by 45 minutes, which to me starts to be significant. Now, of course, it's not speaking to sleep quality, but here we go. They did find that there were some measures of sleep quality that were impacted. But anyway, said another way, if you plan to go to bed at 10 p.m., your last cup of coffee needs to be consumed by 1:12 p.m. to not negatively impact your sleep. And so I think there's often that 3 to 4 p.m. window that people get a little bit tired and look for that afternoon pick-me-up, and to really think about that and how it might be impacting your sleep, as well as that kind of the afternoon window for pre-workout supplements. Pre-workout supplements are always with caffeine, not always, almost always with caffeine. And so that can also be impacting your sleep as well.
So if you do like a pre-workout and then work out at 6 p.m. And then watch Netflix for a couple hours, probably not helping yourself.
Probably not going to have good sleep. Right.
Cool. Awesome. Anything else as it relates to this particular subject before we bounce into our closeout, our hot cake?
Yeah, I think you hinted at melatonin a little bit, so I'm sure people are wondering,
yes.
EC, you did not talk about supplements. We're going to do a whole supplement episode. I think it'll be out in about a month or so. So we're going to talk sleep supplements. Fear not.
Amazing. Cool. Okay. Look out for that, folks. Make sure you are subscribed wherever you're listening or watching that so you don't miss it. Okay. We're going to jump into a hot cake in just a moment. A hot cake all about ultra processed foods, which you did mention a little bit in that previous conversation. But first, I want to make sure folks know and are ready for and excited for the 3 Pillars Masterclass that is coming in January. If you're finally ready to ditch the diet confusion, make sure you check out EC's 3 Pillars Masterclass. EC, one of my favorite things that I get to do at the end of the tail end of your masterclasses, I tend to do like a short interview with 3 or 4 participants. And one of the questions I always ask, because we sort of learned that like this is a useful question for us to ask, is cool. Like you listen to the podcast, you clearly follow EC, you get the newsletter. Why did you need to jump in the masterclass? Aren't we giving you enough? And with hands down, every single person's like, yeah, I do all those things. And the masterclass still surprised me with things that I didn't understand or strategies I didn't do or didn't have. And so I'd love for you to just give us like what is the primary difference between like all of this stuff that we talk about every single week, all the things you put out on social and that masterclass?
Yeah. It's the difference between knowledge and application. You can listen to something and understand it conceptually, and that's not the same as applying it in your daily life. And I find people who are very knowledgeable and have certainly read a lot and listened to a lot, but still either have misbeliefs about their diet, about things that they thought they had to do in their diet, or thought their diet wasn't quite what they thought it was. And so we have this time together to really put pen to paper and see how this plays out for you in the day-to-day, making meal choices, with travel, with weekends, all of that stuff, and really get an actionable plan and transfer that knowledge into action.
Love that. Okay, like I said, the next one is coming down the pike in January. Now is the time to get on the wait list. Go to optimizemenutrition.com/masterclass. You can also click on the link in the show notes. Get on that waiting list. You'll be the first folks in when EC opens it up. Okay. EC, let's wrap this up with a hot cake. Hot cake is when I use this podcast as an excuse to have you explain something that I'm confused about that I've come across on the internet. This week, we've got an article from The Guardian. The headline, the title is Fast Food Fever, How Ultra-Processed Foods Are Unhealthier Than You Think. I don't need to give too much more context than that, but there were 2 particular things in this article that I wanted to ask you about. One is related to so-called healthy foods that are not healthy foods. Specifically in this article, it's referencing like vegan or vegetarian food. So that's the first thing. And then the other is an argument that some folks are making about, well, the solution to ultra-processed foods is processing them more and perhaps processing them better. And so I think the only context necessary, this is like I said, an article from The Guardian, which is a UK publication. As the UK is estimated to draw more than 50% of its caloric intake from ultra-processed foods, this is no passing health scare, but an issue that goes to the very heart of our culinary lifestyle. But before looking deeper into the issue, there is an obvious question: what is a UPF? Okay, so ultra-processed food. So let's tackle each one of those things, which is the first one being the rise of what they just call vegan cuisine, which is like all of this foods that's supposed to be healthy, promotes itself as being healthy, veganism, vegetarianism as well, based on the idea that this is the healthier way to eat. And yet so much of that food fits into this category of ultra processed. Yeah, it does. And it's unfortunate because I do think a lot of people buy it for the health reasons. And I know there's been plenty of times I've been in the grocery aisle walking by various things, and one of the ones that makes me just chuckle every time, it's a brand that sells cookies,
And so they kind of look like Oreos. And then I know on the cover, though, it's like plant-based. I'm like, now I get it. People who are vegetarian and vegan often are making those things not just for the nutritional reason, but also for ethical reasons or maybe environmental reasons. And so I'm always putting those aside. I'm talking strictly from a nutrition point of view that, yeah, the plant-based Oreo, cousin is not really a step up in terms of health. And I do think there's plenty of people who are buying them for that reason, which is unfortunate. We've still now just have the equivalent of an Oreo made with ingredients that came from plants. So yeah, they're everywhere. I think the statistic is the same for the US. I think it's close for us as 50% of our calories are from ultra processed foods. And that's what sells. That's what allows for a great markup. That's what people like. All of that stuff. Yeah, it's everywhere. And vegan replacements are not an exception to that. The other thing that I find this a lot, especially with my plant-based individuals coming through the masterclass, is one of the things that's shocking for some of these plant-based replacements is the sodium content, because oftentimes they're trying to be the meat replacer, right? And so people are like, oh, I'll just use the alternative. And I look at them and they're so high in sodium that we have to be aware of not just kind of the caloric density, but also kind of the salt content they're adding and how both of those could be out of bounds when we take these, ultra processed foods.
It makes me think of, and I'm pretty sure we've talked about it somewhere on this podcast before, but the idea of setting aside the philosophical or the environmental reasons that folks choose a vegan or vegetarian, a lot of it seems to me to be like, oh, if I just make that decision, then therefore I am healthy because of that one decision. And it strikes me that it's one of those cases, to your point about sodium, like when you actually look at it, you have to question that the oversimplification of that justification. Like, well, if I just eat quote unquote vegan or just eat vegetarian, I don't have to think about it anymore. But what you're saying is you don't get to skip that part if you're aiming for health, if you're aiming for performance, whatever it might be.
Yeah, I mean, I guess we already just mentioned in the last episode, but it's never one thing. That if just by calling a diet plant-based, that tells me nothing about the caloric load, that tells me nothing about the sodium load, that tells me nothing about whether or not you're even achieving all of the micronutrients. I mean, yeah, there's a better chance for it to go right, but it depends what plant-based means. And if it's plant-based ultra-processed, it's very likely to be as bad as animal-based ultra-processed or animal-inclusive ultra-processed, right? And so I get it. It would be wonderful if we could make nutrition just based on really, really simple decisions of yes, no. But unfortunately, these labels just don't work, and it's not really meeting kind of the needs for true health and nutrition.
The second thing that popped out at me that I wanted to ask you about, or that I would love your thoughts on, is in the article, one of the researchers says, it might sound silly to talk about reformulation given that highly processed foods have all come about because of the food industry reformulating foods. But I think there's a lot of scope for some of the ultra processed foods to be reformulated to be better. I'd love your thoughts on that. And the thing that I always think about, or the thing I thought about when reading that, is there's this argument in, let's just simplify and say around like social media or technology, maybe more broadly, where like the answer to our addiction to technology is another app. It's another device. Or it's like we're going to solve our problem of technology with more technology. And it sort of seems like the same basic argument here. And I'm not saying for or against it. That's what strikes me as like, well, the solution to ultra processed foods is to ultra process them more.
Yeah. I mean, I don't really see it being wildly successful. What they would have to do is they'd have to add in, for most part, they'd have to add in more water and take away more fat and sugar. So basically, they'd process it to unprocess it. I don't really know if it's going to work. Partially because what will decline is people's interest to eat that product. When you take away the fat and the sugar that they've added in processing and making it more calorically dense, you're also going to take away why people actually like it. And why people keep buying it. So I think it's going to be hard. I think the other thing is, I think that article mentioned what they would do in some of these cases is, let's say they'll take the plant-based cookie and they might add more health protective compounds. Like maybe they'll add, something like these polyphenols that we've talked about briefly. Could be like resveratrol in grapes. That's, red wine has been marketed as healthy. It's anti-inflammatory, whatever. So maybe they're going to add some resveratrol to the plant-based cookie and be like, okay, its antioxidant potential has gone up. It's now anti-inflammatory or something like that. We always have to remember, and I know I've said this a lot, but I think it's really important for people to understand that excess quantity in terms of calories and macronutrients, when eaten to excess in the sense of gaining unhealthy weight, is inflammatory. It's the excess quantity that's inflammatory. And so here we could add some anti-inflammatories to the cookie, but if you still eat too many cookies, we're back to the same square one.
Got it. Okay. Unsurprisingly, not a fan of ultra-processed foods. That's the
I guess I should add, I think we've mentioned this before, that protein powder remains an ultra-processed food that is a good option. It's one of the few out there. I could even be talked into something like the plain variety of the almond milk, because it's just so low calorie. So there's a few, I wouldn't say it's, remarkably healthy in terms of almond milk, but it's fine. It's a fine food out there that's sort of now this ultra processed thing that doesn't really negatively affect the diet. And you could argue improves it by way of sustainability. Same thing with protein powder. So there are a couple examples that I think that there can be products that are processed and are not necessarily bad. It's just that the overwhelming majority of them that we love and consume to the detriment of our health are not so good. Are the chips, the cookies, and all of the various variations of that.
The 50% number did surprise me a little bit. Maybe I shouldn't have been that surprised by it, but 50% of our diet being ultra processed, and that's not just like an adjective that they're using here. Ultra processed is like the fourth step of the
classification,
of how the classifications of how they measure these things. And so 50% being at the far extreme of it, again, maybe I shouldn't have been surprised, but I was.
Well, remember that they typically are more calorically dense. And so it's 50% of total calories. And so
Good point. Yes.
Yeah. You know what I mean? Like, it's really hard to get a lot of your calories in fruits or vegetables. That's sort of my argument for the 800-gram challenge. But yeah, I mean, some of it is just by way of the fact that they're calorically dense. And so not even that much is going to end up being a good portion of your calories. Yeah.
That's a great distinction and a great point. Cool. Thank you, EC. That was great.
Yeah.
Thank you everybody there for listening. Thank you for your ratings and your reviews. If you have not yet, it would be amazing if you left us a review. We always read them. We always love them. And thank you in advance. EC and I'll be back next week for another episode of The Consistency Project.